There is a sound German soldiers on the Eastern Front learned to fear more than artillery. Not the scream of dive bombers, not the rumble of tank treads, not the whistle of incoming shells. A whisper, like fabric tearing, like wind through branches, like, as one soldier wrote in his diary, a broomstick cutting through air. By the time you heard it, the bomb was already falling. By the time you understood what was happening, it was too late. The soldiers who survived these attacks told stories that didn't make sense. Planes that appeared from nowhere, engines that made no sound, pilots who seemed to vanish into darkness. The German command had a name for them: Nachthexen, night witches. By the time the Germans named them, hundreds were already dead. The accounts. Friedrich Weber, Wehrmacht infantry, wrote home in August 1942, "We don't sleep anymore. Every night they come. You hear nothing until the bombs fall. The men say they ride broomsticks. I know this sounds insane, but I have no other explanation." Hans Krohn, anti-aircraft gunner, "You cannot target what you cannot hear. By the time you see the plane against the stars, it's already past. They strike and disappear. It's like fighting ghosts." Ernst Meiberstein, supply officer, "The psychological effect is worse than the material damage. Men become useless after a few nights. They won't sleep. They flinch at wind. Morale collapses." These weren't isolated reports. They appeared in dozens of letters, journals, and official Wehrmacht communications from the Eastern Front between 1942 and 1945. German soldiers, trained and disciplined, described experiences that sounded like folklore. Planes that made no engine noise, bombs that arrived without warning, attacks that seemed supernatural in their precision and silence. Officers tried to maintain order by dismissing the accounts. Tired men seeing things, stress-induced hallucinations, enemy propaganda. But the attacks continued, night after night, multiple times per night. And slowly, the truth became clear. This was a new form of warfare, one the Germans had no effective counter for. The superstition. The nickname Nachthexen, night witches, emerged from German frontline soldiers sometime in 1942. It wasn't official terminology. It was what exhausted, frightened men called an enemy they couldn't understand. The name stuck because it captured something that tactical language couldn't. These attacks felt like dark magic. Witches ride broomsticks. Witches operate at night. Witches appear and disappear. Witches are impossible to fight with conventional weapons. The metaphor made psychological sense, even as it revealed how thoroughly the German military had lost its grip on rationality. These weren't witches, they were pilots, but they had found a way to fight that made trained soldiers believe in the supernatural. The terror of silence. Traditional bombers announced themselves. You heard engines from miles away. You tracked them with searchlights. You fired anti-aircraft guns based on sound and trajectory. The night witches eliminated all of that. They flew low, sometimes just above treetop level. They cut their engines before reaching the target. They glided in silence. The first indication of their presence was the whisper of wind over fabric wings. By then, you had seconds at most. One German report described it this way: "Its sound is not mechanical, it is organic, like breathing. It arrives slowly, then all at once, then the explosion, then silence again. Then it repeats, sometimes 8, 10, 12 times in one night. Sleep becomes impossible, the mind deteriorates." This was psychological warfare, though the Soviet pilots probably didn't think of it that way. They were simply trying to survive and complete their missions with inadequate equipment. But the effect was devastating. Men who endured artillery barrages without breaking developed severe anxiety after a week of night attacks. Commanders rotated troops out of sectors where the night witches operated regularly because soldiers became combat ineffective. The myth takes hold. By 1943, the night witches had become legend on the Eastern Front. Stories spread. German soldiers shared rumors. The pilots were criminals given a choice between execution and suicide missions. They were orphans with nothing to lose. They were volunteers driven by fanatical communist ideology. Some soldiers claimed the planes were made of wood and fabric because metal was too heavy for women to fly. Others said the Soviets sent women because they were willing to die in ways men weren't. The rumors shared a common thread. These pilots were other, not normal, not bound by the same rules as everyone else. This helped German soldiers cope with their fear. If the enemy was supernatural or fanatical or fundamentally different, then being unable to stop them wasn't a failure of German military competence. But beneath the rumors was a truth the German command didn't want to acknowledge. The night witches were effective not because of who they were, but because of how they fought. They had taken obsolete equipment, impossible conditions, and structural disadvantages and turned them into tactical advantages. By the time the German military understood this, it was too late to develop effective countermeasures. The night witches flew on. Operation Barbarossa. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union with over 3 million troops. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military invasion in human history. The German advance was swift, brutal, and catastrophic for Soviet forces. Within weeks, entire Soviet armies had been encircled and destroyed. Within months, German forces had advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. The Red Army lost millions of soldiers, killed, captured, or missing. By December 1941, German troops were within sight of Moscow. The speed of the collapse revealed fundamental problems in Soviet military readiness. Equipment was outdated, command structure was chaotic. Stalin's purges in the 1930s had eliminated experienced officers, leaving the military led by politically reliable but tactically incompetent commanders. The Soviet Union was losing the war so badly that its survival was genuinely uncertain. The manpower crisis. The scale of Soviet casualties created an immediate problem. There weren't enough men. Traditional military doctrine assumed that men would fight and women would support from behind the lines, factory work, nursing, administrative roles. But when you're losing 1 million soldiers every few months, traditional doctrine becomes irrelevant. The Soviet Union needed bodies. It needed anyone who could hold a rifle, fly a plane, operate a tank, or perform any military function. Gender became secondary to survival. This wasn't progressive ideology, it was desperate pragmatism. Soviet propaganda later framed women's military service as evidence of communist gender equality, but the reality was simpler. The Soviet Union was being destroyed, and it couldn't afford to exclude half its population from combat roles. Women volunteered by the hundreds of thousands. Some believed in communist ideology, others wanted revenge for murdered families. Many simply wanted to fight rather than wait passively for German occupation. The Soviet military accepted them because it had no choice. Why women had to fly.
The Soviet Air Force faced particular difficulties. Planes were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Pilots were dying at catastrophic rates. Training programs couldn't keep up with losses. And unlike infantry combat, aviation required technical skills that took time to develop. You couldn't hand someone a plane and expect them to be effective. The Soviet Air Force had one advantage. Before the war, the Soviet Union had invested heavily in civilian aviation clubs and training programs. Thousands of young Soviets, both men and women, had learned to fly in these programs. When the war began, those civilians became the reserve pilot pool. Many were women. They had pilot licenses, they had flight hours, they knew aeronautics. Excluding them made no tactical sense. So the Soviet Air Force began accepting female pilots. Not enthusiastically, not because commanders believed women could fight effectively, but because the alternative was losing the war. The resistance. Military institutions resist change. This is true everywhere, but it was especially true in the Soviet military. Male pilots objected to serving alongside women. Commanders worried about morale problems. Training officers doubted women could handle the physical demands. The objections weren't purely about gender, they were about disrupting established hierarchies and traditions during a crisis when cohesion felt necessary. But the objections were overruled, not by progressive policy, but by Stalin's direct intervention. And Stalin intervened because one person made a compelling case. Her name was Marina Roskova. Survival as innovation. The Eastern Front became a laboratory for military innovation because desperation forced it. Tactics that seemed insane in peacetime became standard. Penal battalions cleared minefields by walking through them. Pilots rammed enemy planes when they ran out of ammunition. Infantry charged machine gun positions because retreat meant execution. Women flying combat missions fit into this context. It seemed desperate. It seemed like scraping the bottom of the barrel. But desperation creates space for experimentation, and experimentation sometimes produces unexpected results. The Night Witches were born from this logic. Use what you have because you have nothing else.
Marina Raskova and the impossible idea. Background. Marina Raskova was already famous before the war. In 1938, she set a world record for long-distance flight, Moscow to the Far East, over 6,000 kilometers in a single journey. When the plane ran low on fuel and needed to lighten its load, Raskova parachuted out with the navigation equipment, landing in the Siberian wilderness. She walked for 10 days before being found. The Soviet press celebrated her as a hero. Stalin personally awarded her the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal. She was a celebrity, she had access to power, and when the war began, she used that access. The petition. In October 1941, with the German advance threatening Moscow, Raskova went directly to Stalin with a proposal. Create all-female air combat regiments. The proposal was radical. The Soviet Air Force had begun accepting individual female pilots, but integrating them into male units. Raskova wanted separate units, women only, from pilots to mechanics to commanders. Her reasoning was practical. Mixed units created social tensions. Male pilots resented women. Women faced constant harassment and skepticism. Morale suffered. All female units would eliminate those tensions. Women could prove themselves without fighting male egos alongside the Germans. Stalin was skeptical, but Raskova was persuasive, and more importantly, she was famous enough that rejecting her would create a public relations problem. Stalin approved the formation of 3 women's air regiments. The 3 regiments.
The 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment would fly Yak fighters in defensive operations. The 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment would fly P-2 dive bombers in daylight attacks. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment would fly night harassment missions in PO-2 biplanes. All three regiments would be composed entirely of women: pilots, navigators, mechanics, armourers, support staff, no men at all, except for senior command oversight. This was unprecedented. No military anywhere had created all-female combat air units operating independently. Raskova commanded the 587th personally. She recruited aggressively young women with flight experience, engineering students, aviation club members. The volunteers came from across the Soviet Union. Some were experienced pilots, others had barely any flight time. Most were teenagers or women in their early 20s. They arrived expecting to defend their country. What they got was institutional indifference bordering on sabotage. Institutional skepticism. The Soviet Air Force approved the regiments. It did not support them. The women received minimal resources, training facilities were inadequate, equipment was second-rate, supplies were delayed or denied. Male commanders made clear they expected the experiment to fail. The women would wash out during training, or they'd be killed quickly in combat, and the Air Force could quietly disband the units and return to normal operations. Orders came. The women's regiments would receive whatever equipment wasn't needed elsewhere. For the 586th and 587th Regiment, this meant older planes, not ideal but manageable. For the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, it meant something else entirely. They were given PO-2 biplanes. The PO-2. The Polikarpov PO-2 was a training aircraft. It was designed in the 1920s to teach student pilots basic flying skills. It was slow, fragile, and obsolete by 1941 standards. Maximum speed 94 miles per hour. Cruising altitude under 10,000 feet. Construction wood frame covered with fabric. Armament none. Defensive weapons none. Radio none. Parachutes not provided. Giving PO-2s to a combat unit was essentially giving them antiques and expecting them to fight tanks. The implicit message was clear: you can have your regiment, but you'll fail, and when you fail, we can end this experiment. The women of the 588th looked at the PO-2s and understood what they meant. They started training anyway.
Training conditions. The 588th began training at Engels Air Base near Saratov in late 1941. Winter in southern Russia is brutal. Temperatures dropped below zero. The barracks were unheated. Uniforms designed for men hung loose on smaller frames. The women wrapped their feet in newspaper for insulation. They cut holes in oversized boots and tied them with string. They wore multiple layers of men's clothing and still shivered through the night. Training proceeded regardless. Flight training, navigation, bombing runs, maintenance, emergency procedures. The women worked 18-hour days. They learned to assemble and disassemble engines in darkness. They practiced bomb loading until they could do it by touch. They flew practice missions until navigation became instinct. Male pilots stationed at Engels watched with barely concealed contempt. Some made bets on how quickly the women would quit. The women didn't quit. No radios. The PO-2 had no radio equipment. This meant pilots couldn't receive orders during flight. They couldn't call for help. They couldn't coordinate with other planes. They couldn't warn each other about enemy positions. Every mission required pre-flight briefing, memorizing targets, routes, timing and contingencies. Once airborne, pilots were entirely on their own. Navigation was visual only. Pilots used landmarks, compass headings, and dead reckoning. At night, in darkness, often under cloud cover. Getting lost was easy. Finding your way back was harder. Some pilots didn't come back. No parachutes. The PO2 was so slow and flew so low that parachutes were considered unnecessary. The official reasoning, you wouldn't have time to use them anyway. The practical effect, if something went wrong, you died. Engine failure meant crash. Getting hit by anti-aircraft fire meant crash. Losing orientation in darkness meant crash. Some women carried pistols, not to fight, to shoot themselves if they crashed behind enemy lines. Capture was not an option. The Germans didn't treat female Soviet pilots as prisoners of war. They treated them as partisans. Partisans were tortured and executed. The PO2 biplane. The PO2 seemed like a death sentence. It was slow. A modern fighter could overtake it in seconds. It was fragile. Machine gun bullets tore through fabric wings like paper. It was ancient, designed before modern air combat tactics even existed. But the women of the 588th began to understand something their commanders hadn't considered. The PO2's weaknesses could become advantages. It was slow, which meant it flew below the stall speed of German fighters. If a fighter tried to attack at the PO2's speed, it would stall and crash. It was light, which meant it could fly low, following terrain, staying beneath radar coverage. It was simple, which meant fewer things could break. Mechanics could repair damage with basic tools and salvage materials. And most importantly, it was quiet. The PO2's engine was small. When you cut the engine and glided toward targets, the only sound was wind over fabric wings. At night, in darkness, that silence was invisibility. The women began experimenting with tactics. What if you approached the target with engines off? What if you attacked from multiple directions? What if you came back immediately after the first run, while the enemy was still scrambling? Their commanders thought they were training for suicide missions. The women were inventing a new form of warfare. Technical detail, turning weakness into advantage. Here's how the PO2's limitations became tactical assets. Speed. The PO2 maxed out at 94 miles per hour. German Messerschmitt fighters stalled below 120 miles per hour. This meant German fighters couldn't slow down enough to attack PO2s without risking a stall. They had to make high-speed passes, which gave them only seconds to aim. Most shots missed. Altitude. The PO2 flew low, often below 1,000 feet. German radar in 1942 couldn't reliably track aircraft that low. Searchlights were less effective close to the ground because terrain blocked them. Anti-aircraft guns struggled with targets that appeared and disappeared behind hills. Construction. The fabric and wood construction made the PO2 nearly invisible to radar. It also meant bullets often passed straight through without hitting anything critical. A metal plane would crumple under machine gun fire. The PO2 absorbed damage and kept flying. Engine sound. This was the breakthrough. When pilots cut their engines and glided toward targets, the only sound was wind, a sound that didn't register as mechanical, a sound German soldiers couldn't distinguish from natural night noise until it was too late. The women realized, we can't outfight the Germans, but we can outthink them. Uniforms made for men. Everything was wrong-sized. Boots were too large, pants dragged on the ground, jackets hung to the knees, gloves fell off hands. The women altered what they could. They cut fabric, they sewed adjustments, they stuffed boots with cloth. But flight suits couldn't be easily altered. They had to wear them as is.
In winter, the loose-fitting clothes meant cold air trapped against skin. In summer, they overheated. Always they were uncomfortable. Male pilots got fitted uniforms. The women got whatever was left over. It was one more message: you don't really belong here. The women flew anyway. Adaptation and grim acceptance. The conditions were designed to make them fail. Inadequate equipment, no radios, no parachutes, oversized uniforms, minimal support. The women adapted. They couldn't change the equipment, so they changed how they used it. They couldn't get parachutes, so they learned to fly so carefully that crashes became rare. They couldn't get fitted uniforms, so they learned to move in clothing that didn't fit. There was no anger, no protest, just grim, practical adaptation. Because the alternative was giving up, and giving up meant admitting the skeptics were right. It meant abandoning the fight while their country was being destroyed. So they adapted. They trained, they prepared, and in spring 1942, they deployed to the front.
Night flight mechanics. A typical mission began 2 hours after sunset. Pilots and navigators received briefings, target coordinates, known anti-aircraft positions, weather conditions, route. They memorized everything. No written notes in the cockpit. If shot down, you didn't want documents falling into German hands. Then, pre-flight checks. The PO2 had an open cockpit, pilot in front, navigator behind. No windscreen, no protection from wind, cold, or weather. In winter, temperatures at altitude dropped to -20 Celsius or lower. The women wore everything they had: layers of clothing, leather jackets, scarves wrapped around faces. Still, they froze. Engines started. The PO2's sound was distinctive, a rough, stuttering cough, then a steady, low rumble. Takeoff was the most dangerous part. Overloaded with bombs, the PO2 struggled to gain altitude. If the engine failed during takeoff, there was no time to recover. Most crashes happened in the first minute after takeoff. If you survived takeoff, you climbed slowly to cruising altitude, rarely above 3,000 feet. Then, navigation. At night, landmarks disappeared. Pilots navigated by compass heading, airspeed, and elapsed time. Navigators tracked position using maps and stopwatches. Getting lost was easy. Finding the target was harder. Engine idling, gliding. As you approached the target, usually 5 or 6 kilometers away, you began the most dangerous phase. You climbed higher, maybe 1,500 meters if you had time and altitude to spare. Then you cut the engine. The sudden silence was total. The only sounds, wind over wings, the creak of wooden frame, your own breathing. You glided. The PO2 glided well, better than most planes. You could stay airborne for several minutes on a descent from 1,500 meters if you controlled your rate carefully. In that silence, you navigated by sight. You looked for the target, campfires, vehicle headlights, muzzle flashes, anything that marked enemy positions. The navigator tapped your shoulder to indicate direction: left, right, straight. No words. Sound carried at night. You adjusted course in silence, gliding, dropping altitude. Below, German soldiers heard nothing. The wind over fabric wings sounded organic, like wind through trees, like an animal moving through darkness, not like a plane. Bomb release. The PO2 carried bombs strapped beneath the fuselage and wings, usually 100 to 200 kilograms total, 4 to 6 small bombs. Not enough to destroy major installations, but enough to kill soldiers in trenches, destroy parked vehicles, ignite ammunition stores. The navigator released the bombs manually. There was no automated system. just a lever that disconnected the bomb racks. Timing was critical. Release too early, you missed. Too late, the explosion could damage your own plane. The navigator counted down by tapping the pilot's shoulder. 3 taps, 2 taps, 1 tap. Release. The bombs fell. Then restart the engine immediately. Because the explosion announced your presence, every German soldier within earshot now knew you were there. Searchlights swept the sky, anti-aircraft guns rotated toward the sound. You had seconds to restart the engine and escape before they found you. The PO2's engine was temperamental. Sometimes it restarted on the first try. Sometimes it took 3, 4, 5 attempts. If it didn't restart, you glided in silence, losing altitude, hoping to make it back to friendly territory before you crashed. Low-altitude attack patterns. The 558th developed tactics through trial and error. Early missions followed conventional bombing patterns: approach from one direction, drop bombs, return home. German anti-aircraft crews learned to predict this. They positioned guns along likely approach routes. When German planes appeared, they saturated the area with fire. The women adapted. They began approaching from multiple directions simultaneously, 3 or 4 planes attacking the same target from different angles within minutes. German gunners had to choose which plane to target. Usually they chose wrong. They varied timing. The first plane attacked at 2 a.m., the second at 2:15, the third at 2:30. Just as German soldiers were falling back asleep, another attack. They staged sequential runs. The first plane dropped bombs, then circled back and attacked again from a different direction before returning to base. The psychological effect compounded. German soldiers never knew when attacks were finished. Every sound might be another plane. Sleep became impossible. Multiple sorties per night. This was the brutal reality. 1 mission per night wasn't enough. The PO2 could only carry a few bombs. To deliver meaningful payload, you had to fly multiple missions, land, rearm, take off again. Some nights, pilots flew 8 sorties. Some flew 12. The record was 18 in a single night. Each sortie 30 to 40 minutes flying, 10 minutes on the ground refueling and rearming, then immediately back up. For 8 hours straight. The exhaustion was cumulative. By the 4th or 5th sortie, pilots were operating on muscle memory. Hands flew the plane, while minds struggled to stay conscious. Crashes happened, sometimes from German fire, more often from exhaustion-induced mistakes, misjudged landings, navigation errors, falling asleep in the cockpit. The women pushed through. Because if they stopped, the Germans slept, and rested Germans were more effective soldiers. The point wasn't destroying enemy infrastructure. The point was denying rest, breaking morale, making every night a terror. One specific mission vignette. August 3rd, 1942. Nadezhda Popova. Target: German supply depot near the Caucasus Front. Nadezhda took off at 11 p.m. Her navigator, Katya Ryabova, tapped coordinates into Nadezhda's shoulder as they climbed. The night was clear, too clear. Moonlight made them visible. They spotted the depot from 4 kilometers, vehicle headlights, soldiers moving between tents. Nadezhda climbed to 1,500 meters, cut the engine. Silence. They glided. Katya navigated by tapping, left shoulder for left, right shoulder for right, both shoulders for straight. No words. Sound carried at night. You adjusted course in silence, gliding, dropping altitude. Below, German soldiers heard nothing. The wind over fabric wings sounded organic, like wind through trees, like an animal moving through darkness, not like a plane.
At 400 meters, searchlights clicked on below. The Germans had heard something, not the engine, there was no engine sound, but maybe the wind, maybe instinct. The lights swept the sky. Nadezhda held course. If she restarted the engine, they'd pinpoint her location immediately. Her only chance was staying silent. The searchlights passed them, kept sweeping. At 200 meters, Katya released the bombs. 4 explosions. Vehicles ignited, ammunition cooked off in secondary blasts. Nadezhda restarted the engine. It caught on the second try. Below, anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Tracers cut the darkness. Nadezhda banked hard, dropping to 100 meters, following a river valley away from the target. Tracers followed, then stopped. The Germans lost them in the darkness. 40 minutes later they landed, refueled, rearmed, took off again at 1 a.m. They flew 7 missions that night.
First-person accounts. Years after the war, survivors of the 588th gave interviews. Their accounts reveal something propaganda never acknowledged. They were terrified. Nadezhda Popova. Every night I thought, tonight I die. Every takeoff I said goodbye to the sky. When I landed, I was surprised to still be alive. Irina Sabrova. Fear is always there. Before every mission, during every mission. It doesn't go away. You just learn to fly while afraid. Yevgenia Zhigalenko. People think we were brave. We weren't. We were doing what needed to be done. Brave would be not being afraid. We were always afraid. The propaganda image, fearless Soviet heroines, motivated by communist ideology, charging into danger without hesitation, was fiction. The reality, young women, many still teenagers, flying obsolete planes in darkness, knowing each mission might be their last, doing it anyway because the alternative was unacceptable. Fear before missions. Before night missions, pilots developed rituals. Some wrote letters they hoped wouldn't need to be sent. Others checked and rechecked equipment obsessively. A few prayed, quietly, because religion was officially discouraged. Some vomited from anxiety before every flight. Others sat in silence, mentally rehearsing every step of the mission. There was no bravado, no pretending they weren't afraid. They acknowledged the fear, then they flew anyway. Death of comrades. The 588th lost 30 pilots and navigators during the war, killed in action or dying from injuries. Each death hit hard. These weren't anonymous casualties. The regiment was small enough that everyone knew everyone. Pilots and navigators were partners, friends, sometimes lovers. When someone didn't come back, the entire regiment felt it. There were no formal mourning periods. The war didn't allow time. The next night, missions continued, but pilots carried the weight. Claudia Formachova. After Tanya died, I couldn't fly for 2 days. Not because I was injured, because every time I started the engine, I heard her voice. My commander told me, you fly tonight, or you don't fly ever. So I flew, but Tanya never left the cockpit with me. Humor as survival. The women developed dark humor as a coping mechanism. They joked about the PO-2's fabric wings. At least bullets go straight through. In a metal plane, they'd rattle around inside. They joked about German searchlights, free heating, we'd freeze without them. They joked about death. If I crash, don't waste a bullet on me. The impact will do the job. The humor wasn't funny. It was a release valve for pressure that had no other outlet. Wing-walking bomb incident. Sometimes bombs failed to be released. The mechanism would stick. The navigator would pull the lever and nothing would happen. You couldn't land with live bombs attached. The impact would detonate them. So someone had to climb out of the cockpit mid-flight, walk out onto the wing, and manually dislodge the bomb, at night, at altitude, with wind speeds that could blow you off the wing. Several navigators did this. not because they were fearless, because the alternative was dying in a crash. Rufina Gasheva walked out onto the wing 3 times during the war. Each time she was terrified. You don't think, you just move. If you think about what you're doing, you freeze. So you don't think, you climb out, you fix the problem, you climb back, then you shake for an hour. The quiet moments. Between missions, in the few hours available for rest, pilots didn't talk about fear. They talked about home, about plans after the war, about normal things, recipes, books, music, dreams. The normality was protective. It created psychological distance from the terror. If you could imagine life after the war, you could believe you might survive to see it. Nadezhda Popova. We talked about opening a bakery together, Katya and I. We planned the menu, where we'd get ingredients, what we'd name it. We talked about this for 2 years. Neither of us believed it would happen, but planning it made the next mission possible. Courage under sustained fear. The 588th flew missions for 3 years, nearly every night, multiple sorties per night. That's over 1,000 missions per pilot. 1,000 nights of fear, 1,000 takeoffs knowing you might not land, 1,000 glides through darkness with Germans shooting at you. This wasn't momentary courage, this was sustained courage under conditions that would break most people. The women didn't describe themselves as brave, they described themselves as doing what was necessary. But necessity doesn't diminish courage. If anything, it reveals courage more clearly. They were afraid, and they flew anyway, again and again and again. That's not fearlessness. That's something harder.
German countermeasures. By mid-1943, the German military understood the night witches were a serious problem. Frontline reports documented psychological breakdown among troops subjected to repeated night attacks. Commanders requested more anti-aircraft support. Intelligence officers tried to identify patterns. The Germans deployed additional searchlights. They positioned anti-aircraft guns along probable approach routes. They stationed fighter patrols at night. None of it worked well. Searchlights were effective only if you knew where to point them. The PO2s approached from random directions and stayed low enough that terrain blocked searchlights. Anti-aircraft guns required lead time. You had to hear the plane, identify direction, aim, fire. Against conventional bombers, this worked. Against planes that made almost no sound until bombs were already falling, it didn't. Fighter patrols faced an impossible problem. The PO2 flew too slow. Fighters had to approach at high speed, which gave them seconds to acquire and hit a target. And hitting a small, slow, dark target at night was nearly impossible. Iron Cross incentives. The German military became so frustrated that they offered an Iron Cross, a significant military decoration, to any pilot who shot down a night witch. The incentive revealed how serious the problem had become. The Iron Cross wasn't given lightly. Offering it for shooting down a single obsolete biplane indicated desperation. Despite the incentive, few German pilots claimed kills against the 588th, not because they didn't try, but because the PO2 was extraordinarily difficult to shoot down. It flew too low for high-altitude interception, it flew too slow for effective low-altitude attack, and it operated at night when visual acquisition was nearly impossible. The few German pilots who did shoot down PO2s usually did it by luck, spotting one silhouetted against moonlight, or catching one during takeoff or landing when it couldn't maneuver. In open-air combat, the PO2's supposed vulnerabilities became strengths. Difficulty shooting them down. Josef Kochiok, a German fighter ace, described attempting to engage a PO2. I spotted it against clouds. I reduced speed as much as I could, but my Messerschmitt stalls below 150 km/h. The Russian plane was flying perhaps 120. I made a pass. I overshot. I tried again. Same result. On the third pass, I came in too slow and nearly stalled. I had to abort. The biplane disappeared into darkness. I felt like I'd been outflown by a museum piece. This wasn't an isolated experience. Multiple German pilots reported similar frustration. The PO2 was so slow that it existed below the operational envelope of modern fighters. Engaging it required slowing to dangerous speeds, which put German pilots at risk of stalling and crashing. The few confirmed kills usually came from ground fire, not air combat. Grudging respect. By 1944, some German accounts shifted from mockery to grim acknowledgement. A Wehrmacht report from the Crimean Front: the Night Bomber units demonstrate exceptional tactical innovation. Their use of obsolete aircraft in unconventional roles has proven more effective than our intelligence anticipated. Morale effects on frontline troops are significant. Recommend prioritizing countermeasures. This wasn't praise, but it was recognition. The Germans had stopped dismissing the Night Witches as a joke. They understood this was a real threat that required real resources to counter. But by then, it was too late. The 588th had developed tactics the Germans couldn't effectively counter, and they had been operating successfully for 2 years, long enough that attempting to develop countermeasures felt like chasing a problem that had already done its damage. Escalation. As the war progressed and German forces retreated, the Night Witches' missions changed. Early war, harassment bombing, disrupt sleep, destroy supplies, create psychological pressure. Late war, tactical support. The Red Army advanced rapidly. The Night Witches flew missions to soften German defensive positions before Soviet ground assaults. The targets became harder. More anti-aircraft fire, better prepared defenses, higher casualty rates. But the women continued flying, because that's what they'd been doing for 3 years. It was the job. Nothing had changed, except the intensity. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, pilots in the 588th had flown tens of thousands of sorties. Some pilots had over 1,000 missions. They had helped win the war. They expected recognition. They were disappointed.
War ends. May 9th, 1945. Germany surrendered. The 588th received orders to cease operations. The war on the Eastern Front was over. Pilots gathered on the airfield. Some cried, others sat in silence. The relief was overwhelming. They had survived. For 3 years they had lived with the assumption that death was probable. Now, suddenly, they could imagine futures beyond the next mission. But the relief was complicated by grief. 30 women from the regiment had died, hundreds of others from the broader Soviet Air Force. And now, what next? Regiment disbanded. Within weeks, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was officially disbanded. The women received orders: return to your homes, resume civilian life. No transition period, no demobilization support, just you're done, go home. The abruptness felt like dismissal. They had fought for 3 years. They had flown over 23,000 sorties. They had been essential to Soviet military operations. And now they were being sent away like temporary workers whose contracts had expired. Medals awarded quietly. 23 women from the 588th received the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest Soviet military decoration. This should have been celebrated, public ceremonies, national recognition. Instead, the medals were awarded with minimal publicity. Why? Because the Soviet state had complicated feelings about women in combat. During the war, women's military service had been framed as temporary necessity. defending the motherland during a crisis. The implication was clear. Once the crisis ended, women would return to traditional roles. Celebrating women's combat achievements too loudly would legitimize women in non-traditional roles permanently. The state didn't want that. So the medals were given, but quietly, without the fanfare male heroes received. Immediate pressure to return to normal. Soviet society after the war was traumatized and desperately trying to rebuild. 27 million Soviet citizens had died. Cities were destroyed, infrastructure was shattered, the economy was collapsed. In that context, the social message was everyone back to your designated role. Men return to work, women return to domestic life, rebuild the family structure, repopulate. For women who had been combat pilots, this message was jarring. They had spent 3 years in positions of responsibility and competence. They had made life or death decisions. They had proven themselves in the most extreme circumstances possible. Now, they were expected to return to being daughters, wives, mothers, and to never mention what they'd done. The unspoken pressure. No official policy said women couldn't talk about their service, but social pressure made it clear, don't. If you talked about being a combat pilot, men reacted with skepticism or hostility. Other women reacted with confusion or disapproval. The message was, what you did during the war was necessary, but it's over now. Don't make an issue of it. For women who had found identity and purpose in military service, this was devastating. They had done something extraordinary, and society wanted them to pretend it didn't matter. Difficulty reintegrating. Nadezhda Popova returned to her hometown in 1945. She had enlisted at 19, she returned at 23, 4 years older, but aged far beyond that by what she'd experienced. Her family welcomed her, but they didn't understand her. They asked questions. What was it like? Were you scared? How many Germans did you kill? She tried to answer, but the questions revealed a gap. They were asking about adventure, about excitement. They couldn't grasp the terror, the exhaustion, the weight of losing friends. After a few attempts, she stopped trying to explain. She got a job at a factory, she lived with her parents, she tried to resume life as it had been before the war. It didn't work. Everything felt trivial. Factory work felt meaningless compared to missions that could determine whether soldiers lived or died. Social conversations felt shallow. She couldn't relate to people who hadn't experienced what she'd experienced. She felt isolated in a way combat never made her feel. In the regiment, everyone understood. Now, no one did. Rejection by men. The bigger problem was romantic relationships. Soviet men returning from war carried trauma and often rigid ideas about gender roles. They had fought, they had endured. They wanted to come home to women who represented normalcy, stability, femininity. Women who had been combat pilots disrupted that. When men learned Nadezhda had been a pilot, reactions ranged from disbelief to hostility. Some didn't believe her. They thought she was lying or exaggerating. Others believed but were threatened. How could they establish traditional authority in a relationship with a woman who had done things they hadn't? A few were interested specifically because of her service, but that interest felt fetishistic, like she was a curiosity rather than a person. Multiple night witches reported similar experiences. We fought for 3 years. We survived. We came home, and men didn't want us. Unwomanly stigma. The accusation was direct. Combat had made them unwomanly. They were too hard, too aggressive, too damaged, too comfortable with violence. Real women stayed home. Real women didn't kill. Real women didn't fly planes. The women who had flown with the 588th found themselves categorized as something other than real women.
This stigma had practical consequences: difficulty finding husbands, difficulty fitting into social circles, constant subtle exclusion from activities defined as feminine. Irina Sebrova: I saved the country, I flew 1,000 missions, I was awarded the hero of the Soviet Union, and my mother's friends said I would never find a husband because no man wants a woman who acts like a man. Alexievich's oral histories. Decades later, journalist Svetlana Alexievich interviewed Soviet women veterans for her book The Unwomanly Face of War. The interviews revealed patterns of silenced trauma. Women who had fought didn't talk about it for 40, 50 years, not to their husbands, not to their children, sometimes not even to other veterans. The silence was protective, but also corrosive. They carried experiences they couldn't share, trauma they couldn't process, pride in what they'd done mixed with shame that they'd done it at all. One veteran told Alexievich, I stopped telling people I was a pilot. When I met my husband, I lied. I said I worked in a factory during the war. It was easier than explaining, easier than seeing the look in his eyes. Another, my daughter found my medals after I died. She called my sister, confused. Mother was a hero. Why didn't she tell me? My sister said, because no one wanted to hear. Identity fragmentation. The women of the 588th existed in psychological limbo. The civilian world didn't know what to do with them. The military didn't need them anymore. Their identities as pilots, the thing that had defined them for 3 crucial years, had no place in peacetime society. Some tried to maintain connections with other veterans. They wrote letters, they visited each other when possible. But geography separated them. Life moved forward. Families and jobs created new obligations. The bonds formed during war couldn't fully translate to peace. Many women reported feeling like they were living double lives: the person they showed the world and the person they had been during the war. The war version felt more real, but it was the version they had to hide. Long-term psychological costs. Post-traumatic stress wasn't understood in the 1940s. There was no therapy, no recognition that combat created lasting psychological damage. Veterans were expected to move on. The Night Witches dealt with trauma alone. Nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping, startle responses to loud noises, an inability to feel safe. They had no framework for understanding these symptoms. They thought they were broken, weak, unable to adapt. Some drank heavily, others withdrew to depression, a few committed suicide. The society that had celebrated their service during the war abandoned them afterward. The years of silence. For most Night Witches, the period from 1945 to the 1980s was characterized by silence. They lived normal lives, worked jobs, raised families, participated in their communities, and they never talked about what they'd done. It wasn't until the Soviet Union began opening up in the 1980s, during Glasnost, that interest in women's wartime service re-emerged. Journalists like Alexievich started documenting stories. Some veterans began speaking publicly. But by then, many had already died. The stories they might have told were lost. And the women who did speak often described the decades of silence as worse than the war itself. During the war, they had purpose, they had comrades, they had identity. After the war, they had none of those things. They were needed in war, inconvenient in peace.
Return to the night. There's a sound German soldiers feared more than any weapon. Not the sound itself, the absence of sound. Silence where there should be engines, darkness where there should be light, the whisper of wind over fabric wings approaching through air that should be empty. The Night Witches flew into that darkness 3 years. They turned obsolete planes into psychological weapons. They made silence lethal. And when the war ended, they returned to a different kind of darkness. The darkness of being forgotten, of having your story erased, of accomplishing something extraordinary and being told to never speak of it. What silence means. The night witches weren't forgotten because people didn't care. They were forgotten because their story was inconvenient. It complicated gender narratives. It challenged assumptions about who could be a warrior. It suggested that women could do things society preferred to believe women couldn't do. So the story was quietly set aside. The medals were given. The official records exist, but the cultural memory, the stories told and retold, the place in collective consciousness never fully formed. Most people who know anything about World War II don't know about the Night Witches. Those who do know usually learned recently, through articles or documentaries made decades after the fact. The women themselves lived through this erasure. They watched male veterans receive parades, monuments, public recognition. They received silence. The weight they carried. What does it do to a person to accomplish something extraordinary and then be told to pretend it didn't matter? The Night Witches carried that weight for decades. They had been needed, they had proven themselves, they had saved lives and won battles and changed how aerial warfare worked. And then they were dismissed. That dismissal was its own trauma, layered on top of combat trauma, displacement, loss, all the weight they already carried. Some found ways to process it. They built lives around other identities. They found meaning in family, work, community. Others never fully recovered. They lived with a sense that the most important thing they'd ever done had been erased.
Cold air, darkness, exhaustion. The conditions they flew in never left them. Even decades later, veterans described dreaming of cold, of darkness, of exhaustion so profound that consciousness felt like a burden. Those sensations became permanent, not memories exactly, more like imprints, ways their bodies remembered what their minds tried to forget. Nadezhda Popova interviewed in 2000. I still wake up at night thinking I need to fly. For a moment, I'm 22 again, and there's a mission. Then I remember the war ended 55 years ago, but my body doesn't know that. They were never fearless. The final truth, the one that matters most, the Night Witches were never fearless. They were afraid every night. They flew anyway. They weren't superhuman. They were ordinary women given impossible tasks and inadequate tools. They succeeded not because fear didn't exist, but because they refused to let fear make their decisions. That's harder than fearlessness. Fearlessness is the absence of fear, an easy state if you can achieve it. Flying while afraid, night after night, mission after mission, for 3 years, that's different. That's choosing action despite terror. That's continuing when every instinct says stop. That's waking up knowing you might die today and flying anyway. What remains? The Po-2 biplanes are gone now. Most were scrapped after the war. A few remain in museums, fabric wings preserved behind glass, engines silent. The air bases where they trained are abandoned or repurposed. The women who flew them are nearly all dead. The last Night Witch, Nadezhda Popova, died in 2013 at age 91. What remains is memory, incomplete, fragmentary, often wrong, stories that simplify what happened, descriptions that miss the complexity, tributes that honor the women by turning them into symbols rather than humans. The Night Witches exist now mostly as myth, brave Soviet women who flew dangerous missions, heroes of the Great Patriotic War. The myth isn't false, but it's not complete. It misses the fear, the exhaustion, the cold, the silence after the war, the decades of living with weight no one acknowledged.
It misses the truth that they weren't heroes by choice. They were ordinary people placed in impossible circumstances who decided that giving up was unacceptable. The sound of wind over wings. At night, in certain conditions, wind sounds like fabric tearing. It sounds like something approaching that shouldn't be there. It sounds like the absence of engines where engines should be. The Germans who heard that sound knew what it meant. They learned to fear silence more than noise. The women who created that sound knew something different, that fear is always present and courage is not its absence. Courage is acknowledging fear and acting anyway. Courage is being terrified and flying into darkness anyway. Courage is surviving the war only to face a peace that doesn't want you and continuing to live anyway. Final truth. The Night Witches weren't fearless. They were simply unwilling to let fear decide. That's the hardest kind of courage, the kind that doesn't end when danger ends, the kind that requires waking up every day and choosing to continue despite everything. They flew through darkness for 3 years. Then they lived through darkness for 50 more. Both required the same strength. Both deserve to be remembered.